Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever wondered how leaders of closed groups justify breaking their own rules without, completely tearing the group apart? Well, today we're looking at a genuinely fascinating real-world paradox. Just imagine a group whose foundational text strictly forbids idolatry, but then, out of nowhere, a new directive commands them to hang a portrait of a sun god. I mean, how do they logically and semantically stretch their framework to make that fit? Let's map out exactly how this ideological defense works. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting the core ideological contradiction, shifting timelines and directives, worship versus appreciation, redefining the sun god, and finally, energy and strategic defense. Starting us off with Section 1, the core ideological contradiction and the ideological rift it created. So, this whole situation was actually brought to light by a super observant follower within the group, known as Follower 819. They noticed a serious rift, and it essentially boils down to this really tough question. How does a group that strictly bans idols justify hanging a portrait of a sun god? If you spent time memorizing the rules, this creates immediate, intense cognitive dissonance. To really understand why this was so jarring, we have to look at their foundational text. Rule 31 explicitly states, there are no buildings or idols used for worship or sacrifice. So, they were strictly 100% anti-idol. But then, leadership issues a brand new directive. They tell followers to hang a portrait of a figure named Zhi Shipao and refer to him as the Eastern sun god. For follower 819, this is just a massive collision. Like, how can you be completely anti-idol, but at the same time hang a portrait of a sun god? That brings us to Section 2, shifting timelines and directives. The first structural defense we see comes from a leader named Shi Zhou, and his strategy is to separate the timeline. He argues that Rule 31 was simply a historical fact. It was just describing their second home era, a time when there genuinely were no idols. But, well, circumstances changed. Zhi Shikao was imprisoned for 11 months and 13 days and completely refused to yield. It was only after this intense crisis on June 20th that the new directive was issued. So the defense here? They argue there's actually no contradiction at all because there's no chronological overlap. Moving on to Section 3, worship versus appreciation, and how they build a semantic defense. Now, what's really interesting about this timeline defense is that while it's definitely clever, it doesn't really solve the deeper philosophical problem. So the leadership meticulously redefines the action itself. They argue that worship involves kneeling, praying, fear, and subservience, basically a relationship where you are beneath the object. But what they are doing, well, they call it appreciation. This involves resonance, learning, and just acknowledging a role model. Because followers aren't expected to cower or kneel in fear, they insist it inherently cannot be idol worship. And they apply this exact semantic split directly to the wording of Rule 31. They argue the rule specifically bans the tools of traditional worship. Physical temples, mud or wood idols, burning incense, the whole shebang. But, they claim, it absolutely allows for honoring a living, breathing hero who stood firm in prison. To them, hanging his picture isn't idolatry. It's a hero's anthem. Which leads right into Section 4, redefining the sun god, and diving into the meaning of the word Shen. Even with this new distinction, follower 819 was still deeply, deeply uncomfortable calling a human being a god, or Shen in Chinese. But the leaders use some pretty brilliant linguistic gymnastics right here. They point out that in Chinese culture, the character Shen often has absolutely nothing to do with a literal religious deity. For instance, phrases like Shen Sai Fei Yang just describe a really radiant temperament, and Yang Bing Ru Shen simply means strategic excellence. Therefore, they argue, calling him the Eastern sun god is really just poetic language for a spirit that illuminates the darkness, kind of like the sun. Then, another leader steps in to reinforce this with let's call it a physics-based framework. They introduce this concept of energy resonance. Instead of religion, looking at the portrait is suddenly framed as a matter of physics and biology. Observing a courageous figure acts as a visual signal that triggers a positive frequency alignment in your own body. By swapping out religious terminology for concepts like frequency and resonance, the leadership basically attempts to neutralize any religious connotations using the language of psychological and physical optimization. And finally, Section 5, energy and strategic defense, and how they respond to pressure. Now, let's pull back to the macro level for a second. You might be wondering, why push this specific directive right now? Well, the leadership reveals this is actually a strategic posture against external pressures. external authorities are already trying to suppress the group using legal charges of superstition. Knowing this, the leadership decides to play a strategic game. Instead of hiding, they deliberately lean into extreme, provocative terminology like sun god as a countermove to project absolute light. The portrait becomes this unifying, defiant symbol. They are essentially saying, "You call us superstitious? Watch us shine even brighter." Which brings us to a really fascinating final thought for this explainer. We've seen how semantics, shifting timelines, and strategic framing can be used to justify almost any internal contradiction. But it leaves us with this big question. How far can a belief system stretch its own foundational rules before it becomes something entirely new? I mean, when you completely redefine worship and redefine God just to make an exception, are you really protecting your original philosophy, or are you quietly rewriting it in real time to survive a crisis? It's a pretty remarkable look at human psychology and ideological elasticity. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll leave you to reflect on that.